everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I am Christine Ingram, the Director of Programs and Events at the Burgwin-Wright House and Gardens. The Burgwin-Wright House is a colonial era house museum that was built on top of the first city jail of Wilmington. We offer tours of our property Monday through Saturday from 10 to 4 with the last tour at 3 p.m. You can find out more information about our site, events, and membership at www.burgwin-wrighthouse.com. For those of you attending online, we are running a webinar style. We cannot see or hear you on this end. However, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A or chat box. I will moderate the questions at the end, alternating between in-person and online. If you have any trouble hearing, please let me know via the chat box and I will let the speaker know. Our speaker tonight is Rick Morrison. He is a retired naval officer, homeland security analyst, and disaster response analyst. He holds degrees in healthcare administration, history, management, and national security and strategic studies. A 2017 graduate from UNC Wilmington in history, Rick currently works as a historic interpreter at the Burgwin-Wright House and Fort Fisher State Historic Site in Kure Beach. Thank you so much, and please help me welcome Rick.
I'm really glad to be here this evening. I'm not ignoring you, and I'm not doing anything on the phone other than making sure I start the timer, because I've been accused of maybe going over 45 minutes a few times on the tours. That's unfounded. I want to thank you for being here this evening. I also want to thank Christine Lamberton, who's the director of the Burgwin-Wright House and Gardens Museum, and Ms. Joy Allen, who's our executive director of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of North Carolina. For asking me to speak here. I really appreciate it. Their dedication and hard work allow us to enjoy the Burgwin-Wright House and Gardens this evening, this wonderful facility you're in right now. And just as a point of interest, yesterday was April 19th, excuse me. April 19th is the 246th anniversary of the shot heard around the world on Village Green in Lexington, Massachusetts. When that occurred, the area you're sitting in right now, a piece below us, a couple of pieces of property out back, were 3 decades old. The house above us was 4 years old. So it's neat to be able to say that and to be in here and do this. And they've also set the standard in many ways for historic preservation and interpretation in North Carolina and other places as well. The Lower Cape Fear has a very vibrant and robust history. It runs the gamut of American history, which makes it fine, both good and bad. Working at the Burgwin-Wright House and Fort Fisher State Historic Site, I get the opportunity to concentrate on Wilmington in both the colonial period and the Civil War. Local history mixed with military history, so I'm pretty happy about that. I'm a colonialist at heart, and so this evening we're going to be talking about the British Southern Campaign of 1778 to 1781 and Wilmington's place in that. I'm going to be touching on North Carolina and Wilmington itself before the Revolutionary War, the Southern Campaign's place in the war, the Southern Campaign itself, and the British occupation of Wilmington in 1781. That said, with my 45 minutes that I've promised I'll do this in, it's going to be broad brushstrokes. Okay, so there's not going to be a lot of excessive detail here. It's the general gist. For clarity for everybody, I will be using 2 terms: Whig for what is normally said to be patriots, and loyalist for the folks that you would call patriots. Okay, so as I go through, I'll do that. Once in a while, I'll probably slip, but I'm trying to do better at that. If at any time you can't hear me because my bride mentioned that I have a tendency to talk softly, please let me know, especially the folks that are online. Now, North Carolina itself is a late bloomer. We're going to talk a little bit about it before the Revolutionary War to understand what's going on. Ignoring the lost colony, which was a 3-year experience that didn't do well for the settlers. The English from Tidewater area up here in Virginia slowly started to come down and immigrate in to the Albemarle Sound area right here. And they they were basically coming down to farm and to trade with the Native Americans that were in the area. Now this, that was about 1750s, continues through the 1600s, and starts to include a growing number of French, Swiss, and Germans. But really there wasn't a lot here in North Carolina in the Northeast section, other than small enclaves. In fact, there were no towns in northeastern North Carolina until New Bern was incorporated in 1705. So it was a formal town at that point. Now, the slow growth was partially due to the Lord's proprietor. There's some economic and political and religious issues between the settlers and them, but it became a royal colony. And then in 1711, we have the Tuscarora War from 1711 to 1713. The truth is, the Native Americans were getting a little upset about their encroachment of the white colonists coming in, and the war was their answer to that. Local militia and colonial militia in this area, there were folks like Colonel Moore, who came up from the Charleston area, put down the Tuscaroras, and after 1713, you see a vibrant increase in the numbers of people that we had. By the 1730s, this area that you see here coming down into the Cape Fear has about 36,000 inhabitants, with a few enslaved African Americans because of some of the work that they're doing with rice and other things. By the 1770s, North Carolina has a population of about 250,000 people. And the difference is that while the initial settlement goes along the coast, this starts going into the Piedmont. Now, these individuals included Germans, German Moravians, Germans, Quakers, Scots-Irish, Highland Scots, sprinkling of other nationalities include French Huguenots, and of course, a small number of Jews in this area based on how they were doing the immigration requirements. They came through the ports of Charleston down here, or in through the port of Wilmington and moved inland. I guess I should stay here. And then at the end of the day, they also were coming down the valleys from the north, the Great Wagon Road, the Upper Road, the Fall Line Road, and then there's also the Kings Highway here, and really populating the interior. The majority of the people in the colony were in the interior by the time you have the 1770s are done. Now, the point I would make there is that they also brought in more of the enslaved blacks, especially in this area, and a little bit up here, for the nascent indigo, rice, and naval stores industries that were occurring there. This rapid population growth, especially in this area, made the religious and ethnic groups tended to cluster in areas, or in general areas they were not tightly clustered. They were a dispersed population, and it really had very little cultural and religious homogeneity. Okay, it wasn't everybody knew who they were, and they were all for the same thing, all for the colony of North Carolina. There were multiple groups out there, and the folks in the Piedmont resented the established planters and merchants who were the political power of the colony, and that creates more and more problems. And what you'll see as we get into the revolution, this creates a group of people out there. You have no idea who they are, and what they're going to do as far as where their allegiances go. This remote part of the world, I took that from one of the books, Karen, I'm blanking on it, who wrote? Wood, Mr. Wood. And just, we're going to talk about our town, Wilmington and Brunswick Town down here, and then also the Cape Fear, which really the lower Cape Fear is this area right here. In 1767, the lower Cape Fear had a population of about 7,900 people, about 62% of which were Black, primarily enslaved African Americans. The second largest city in North Carolina at that point was Wilmington. We had about 1,000 to 1,200 people here in Wilmington. New Bern, the colonial capital, was the largest, with between 1,600 and 1,800 people. Not big by our standards today, but big for the time. It was built on naval stores. The big southern longleaf pine forest, the park, allowed them to have naval stores of pine pitch tar, turpentine, masts, spars, those types of things. In fact, pine tar was about 50% of the exports that came out of this area. That was followed by turpentine and tobacco, lumber, deer skins, beef and pork, bread and flour, planks, steaks, barrels, etc., which weren't produced here, but further up the river system. Rivers were used as a transportation. We had about 80%, 85% of the boards were produced in sawmills here about Cross Creek, which was then Fayetteville today. The area waterways were that fed into the river, allowed some commodities to come in to Cross Creek, the trading post area, and then we brought down on the Cape Fear River, this portion of the Cape Fear River here, down to Wilmington where they were shipped out. Wilmington itself, as you see here, very small town bounded by Chestnut Street here, and Water Street on the side. And then you had 3rd Street at the top and the river here bounding it as well. In truth, it was one of the 2 ports. The other one was Brunswick Town down the river, about 15 miles, but Wilmington was not much of a place. In very many ways, it was a backwater port. It was a place that had really limited strategic value when you think about the war. Why would you want to come here? What was the 12 or 1,600 people, or the 33,000 people in the area, 7,000 people? What risks do they pose to the Brits? And that's part of the question we got to talk about. Why is it that in January 1781, the British finally thought it would be a good idea to show up here and take Wilmington? Why did it take over almost 5 years for them to get that done? And we'll go on and talk about that. Now, before we do it, I want to talk a little bit about the backcountry and the middle group. If you think about it, American society, when we went to war in the Revolutionary War, aside from the fact that we were still arguing over taxes because problems with funding the militia and funding the Continentals and all, we had to worry about the divisions of loyalists that I've already talked about. The general numbers that I've seen is about 20% of the individuals in the colonies at this time could be considered Whigs. Okay, card-carrying Whigs, they're the ones that are really pushing for this move to independence. About another 20% could be considered loyalists. Card-carrying again, they're the ones that are pushing for this. But in the center, you got about 60% of the population that's really having problems with this whole process. In truth, the people in the middle, there were many neutrals, and as always the case in internecine warfare, wanted simply to be left alone to live unmolested lives, raise their families, and conduct their businesses. And if you look at this portion here, where we're talking about, when you get inland, they're largely self-sufficient in supplying for themselves the surplus. Then the products give them stuff that they cannot produce themselves, the salt, the metal objects, those types of things. And they're isolated with, of course, transportation systems, the cultural and ethnic differences. You talk about the Scots the Highland Scots that went up the rivers to the Cross Creek area. They were said to be isolated by religion, language, and clan from everybody else. So you could be all Highland Scots, but you're not going to get along. The Morrisons aren't going to necessarily get along with the MacDonalds. And then the whole language of being Catholics and all 9 yards comes down from that. It's a difficult situation to try to figure out what's going on. And the revolution disrupts their economic movements. You know, they're waiting for the crop to come in. They have to plant at a certain time. They have to do the other things. And these Whigs and loyalists and British troops and Continentals are always going through their area and giving them a hard time, one way or another. And they also have the trade embargoes, the shortages, the troop levies, which is always interesting. You will find that they would have forced oaths of association and allegiance. Both sides would do that. They would come through an area and demand that all citizens take an oath of allegiance to the state of North Carolina or become identified as Tories. They did the same in other areas. At the same time, they would look for people to bring into their organizations. And there was Colonel Thomas Wade of Anson County, not far from here to the northeast, was filling quotas for the Continental Army from loyalists in the area that had either been captured or found out, and they brought them in. So they're going to take the loyalists and they're going to put them into the Continental Army. And his statement was, he promised Tories he described as poor and common men with large families to support a parole if they agreed to serve 3 months with his volunteers. And this proposal brought upwards to 100 of those deluded peoples under arms. Though at first we had to kill a few others, which assured a good end. So welcome to the Army. We're not going to push you into jail and shoot you, and then somebody else is going to take your place. But it's a good mantra. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about all these things that are going on, if you want support here on the coast, or if you're the elite and you want support, for example, if you're a planner or you're a merchant, you've been on the Colonial Assembly and all, folks inland don't distrust you. You've also had a bit of a problem with the regulation where they were worried about the corruption and all in the back. Then it's hard for these people to be brought up, and they're just trying to get by on a day-to-day basis. And as you go on, and we'll go into this now, I got a great quote for those of you my age or a little younger. It's interesting to note that General Clinton, as they're going through to try to settle the backcountry of the South, said many neutrals, as is always in the case of in a nesting war, wanted simply to be left alone to live unmolested lives. I'm sorry, that's Carpenter. But he wanted to gain the hearts and subdue the minds of America. And by 81, he was saying, if we have not their hearts, which I fear cannot be expected, in this case, Virginia, then we may conquer, but we shall never keep. And so this whole issue of this 60% of the population, give or take, who you can't really tie down, creates problems all the way through the war. The phases of the war, the American Revolution of the cause. If you're thinking about how we get here in 1781 to Wilmington, you have to think of the phases of the war. There's actually four phases. It's the way they itself to cut it up so you can study different areas and what was going on. It generally accepted beginning in 1775 with the events at Lexington and Concord, which occurred yesterday. And then ending with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But we're only worried about the first three phases. That last phase comes from Yorktown when Cornwallis surrenders until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And that's outside the scope of what we're doing. Phase one is New England. The whole point here starts in April 19th, 1775. In this case, they say to spring of 1776. Lord North's ministry is tired of the shenanigans that are going on in the colonies. They've had it, especially in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, it's a hotbed of everything. They're the ones everybody's following. And by January of 1775, the king and his ministry had committed to military action to enforce Britain's authority. The strategy was to isolate and crush resistance in the most loyal provinces. But that's basically the stick. And the carrot was to combine overwhelming measures of display, overwhelming displays of force with conciliatory measures. And essentially, if you take Massachusetts, is what they're saying is, then you hope you can crush the spirit of resistance and get the attention of the other colonies and bring them back in line. And that's what they're trying to do. Now, whether or not they do well is already in the history books. April 19th, 75, you have the action at Lexington and Concord, and the troops get driven back, all the way back to Boston. Finally, 72 dead and 250 wounded on that. There were militiamen coming out of the woodwork. and fighting them all the way back. The Siege of Boston begins. In June of 1775, you have the Battle of Bunker's Hill, which is actually Breed's Hill. But 1,200 Americans withstood two waves. The third wave of British troops finally overwhelmed them. Why? They ran out of ammunition. But it was one of those points where it was a Pyrrhic victory. They lost, the American losses were 450 with 115 killed in action. The British had 1,054 casualties trying to go up that hill, of which 26 were killed in action. Howe was the general in charge. One of the generals in charge actually said that one more victory like that, there would not be a British force in North America. So they won, but that's about it. And in June of 1776, because of the cannons being placed up on the heights above the harbor, the British actually had to move out and pull away from Boston. And in December of that year, up here in Quebec, we have the Americans defeated up there. Not a real auspicious year for us, but in some ways it wasn't bad. They found out that we could fight. Bunker Hill proved that, and gives us an opportunity to continue on the war as they go into the quiet season. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, I'll be honest with you, when I grew up out west, my idea of what went on in this period of the Civil War was all in comic books, coloring books. It was the Minuteman and Paul Revere's Ride, and Two If by Land and Two If by Sea at the Old Church, the classic pieces. And I didn't realize until I moved here that North Carolina was actually a part of this, and actually this area. So starts with the burning of Fort Johnson. Now, Lord North had gone with his carrot and conciliatory gestures, and what he basically said to individual colonies, he said, if you go ahead and fund your imperial defense costs, the only taxes that we'll give you are the taxes that are on trade. When we take those taxes, we will refund them to you, as long as you've done the first part, so you can use them for whatever you want. And the intent was to undermine the authority of the Continental Congress and all that, because they went individually to each one of the colonies, and then the individual colony is going to treat individually with the crown. And they had a bit of a problem with that. When he went out to the governors and all that, all the royal governors, with one exception, came back, New Hampshire and South Carolina, and declared themselves powerless to even accomplish that. The continental legislatures in the colonies were establishing, revolutionary governments. They were choosing delegates for the Second Continental Congress. They were raising armed forces. They were supporting economic sanctions against England. And that whole deal about Massachusetts, they were attempting to provide material support to Massachusetts. So not really much was going to come up with that, with one exception. A gentleman by the name of Josiah Martin, governor of North Carolina, came out and said that he was sure that there were enough loyalists in the colony of North Carolina to maintain sovereignty of the colony. And that started people thinking in the North administration that maybe you still could stop them. You could start getting back control of individual colonies. And he also, that they really didn't think it was going to happen, but they were hopeful. But they became preoccupied, the government became preoccupied with stuff happening up in Massachusetts. And it wasn't until September 75 that new dispatches came from Martin and said, listen, this is really important. Dunmore and Virginia also said the same thing. We can do this. There's enough loyalists here that we can control the colonies and put them back into line with Great Britain. And our good friend Martin also confided that if he used the loyalists in the Piedmont, remember that group that's about 80% of everybody's worried about, If you could provide him with 10,000 stands of arms, that's a rifle with the accoutrements that go with it for a soldier, 6 field pieces and ammunition, along with money and authority to proceed, he thought with a small investment, there was thought with a small investment, they could get potentially large results. And so Lord North supports and Britain supports a campaign. He supports a campaign to go against the Lower Cape Fear and support Governor Martin. There's a problem with this in that problem with this is that when those last dispatches were written, Martin's on the cruiser. It's a ship, HMS Cruiser. It's an 81-foot, 8-gun sloop off of Fort Johnston. He's been forced in a to leave Newburgh, sends his wife to New York for safety, and he comes down to Fort Johnston to meet up with Captain Collette, who's in charge down there, and then he starts to send the dispatches that he has. He's there at the fort. He finds out that militia forces under Cornelius Harnett and Robert Howe of Brunswick County, and also John Ash from the New Hanover County militia, upwards to 500 men, were coming down to deal with him at Fort Johnston. And he moves over to the ship offshore. And on July 18th, in 1775, the militia troops actually burned the fort. So here he is sending these messages out that everything's going to be fine if he gets ammunition and all the other things. And at the end of the day, he's forced onto the ship, and the fort itself is burned. The cruiser and the militia continued sending shots to each other, going after each other. But the bottom line is it increased the confidence of the Whig forces because the British couldn't overcome them. So it changes the dynamic. But he continues to sell that point of they could happen. Well, distance, weather, and port communications end up scuttling many of the British plans. The North administration and the Brits thought that they could send an expedition down here. They have enough troops, the regular troops, to actually change the dynamic down here. And in England, they assigned General Lord Cornwallis to lead an expeditionary force out of County Cork in Ireland. And from there, they would come across and meet with Clinton, who was coming down from New York with troops by sea, and launch an expedition into the Lower Cape Fear to meet up with loyalists, primarily Highland Scots, who are going to be recruited up in the Cross Creek area, arm them, and start using the Whigs, the loyalists, to then affect this change that you can here in this area. The problem is that Clinton was delayed coming down. Cornwallis was definitely delayed. He's supposed to leave on the 1st of December. He doesn't get here until May. And the loyalists, the Scots, they jump the gun and they start massing to come down to Wilmington to meet up so they can get the weapons and all the things that go along with that. They are met at Moore's Creek, and the battle lasts about 45 seconds. It's all terrain, it's all weapons, and people that have broadswords don't do real well against that. And that crushes the ability of the Highland Scots or anybody else to meet Clinton when he finally shows up. When he does, he finds out that there's nothing here, and he continues on to South Carolina. Now, not to be outdone, Cornwallis does show up in May of '76, and they take control of the lower part of the Cape Fear down there by Smith's Island and all. And they also sortie out to Brunswick Town And there were two burnings of Brunswick town, one possibly by Captain Quillette in March of 76, but in May of 76, the sailors and troops of Cornwallis actually burned Brunswick town, and it goes away. Which interestingly enough means that Wilmington is now a deep port on the lower Cape Fear. Brunswick town is no more. And it's in about as good shape then as it is today. When you go down there, there's foundations. Phase two. I'm going to be quick on this one because I know that I've been too long already. Plans here is to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies and destroy the Continental Army. The intent is for how to go up the Hudson River Valley. You have Cornwallis to take Philadelphia down here. And by doing that, then by going up the Hudson Valley, Burgoyne can come down the Hudson Valley, the two armies can meet together, and then you can defeat all the forces in this area, and then go on and replenish Massachusetts and New England. The problem is that Cornwallis does go to Philadelphia, decides to stay there, does not meet up with John Burgoyne, and at Saratoga, Burgoyne is forced to surrender, and it changes the true dynamic of the war. In this case, becomes a world war. France in 1788, Spain in 1779 enter it. And the point of what they're doing here is they're still smarting from the losses they had during the 7 Years' War. And they're coming to, the French are going to support the Americans, the Spanish are going to support the French because they don't want their colonies to figure out it's okay to do this. But rather than they're interested in this area, the Med, and this area, stuff in the Caribbean here, and even over here into the Indian Ocean, they're not really worried about the Americans as far as the French and the Spanish. So what do they want to do? Well, they're going to go ahead and supply the United Americans, give them some mutual support, find other things to hold the forces here, and then start going after the other parts of the empire that they want. And it becomes a problem in a world war. What are you going to do? What are you going to protect? You're going to put your resources to the higher value items. Colonial America, North America was worth less annually than the good island of Barbados. Sure. So they were more than willing, the ministry was more than willing to give up on the colonies, except for, sorry, good friend down here, sorry, I can do this. Except for this gentleman right here, George III, came out and said they actually had to keep it. The conquest of these provinces is considered by the king as an object of great importance. He couldn't see the rest of his colonies staying in, especially in the Caribbean, if he lost. So he was wanting to push it on. They decided then to mount the Southern campaign. This is where things change. Now they believe Mark have been pushing and pushing for more and more of this, and they believe that they can cut down the Carolinas, hold up north a little bit in New York, cut down the Carolinas, down in the Carolinas, take them out, and then bring in loyalists to different areas. Their hearts and minds and move north. It's the fortified hamlets that we saw in Vietnam. It's the same type of deal. But it's the way they're going to try to do it. And I'm not sure that they're going to be, they really believed it was going to happen. They were wishing. John Shai had people numerous and armed rights that no longer would British troops try to occupy and hold directly every square foot of the territory. Instead, the war would be Americanized. Territory, once liberated will be turned over as quickly as possible to loyal Americans for police and defense, free and redcoats to move on to the liberation of the relatively small British force that could conquer all of that whole South and then take it into the rest of the Americans. They didn't capitalize well. The problems are they tried early on down here in Georgia. Van and get up in Augusta. They don't get the Whig support. They want 6,000 Whigs. They ended up for militia forces. They get 1,000. They're just not coming out of the woodwork. They start from Charleston. They take Charleston in May 1780. They move up from there to Camden. Battle of the Cowpens over the mountain, the Battle of Kings Mountain, where loyalist militia defeat the Whig militia defeats loyalist militia, and then on up to Guilford Courthouse. Now, what's the importance of this? All the way along, Cornwallis wanted to clear and hold, but he wasn't staying around to support the loyalists when they were coming in to hold the area. So in other words, you don't have redcoats there, a small group of redcoats, to provide an extra force if necessary, while the loyalists are establishing the local government and managing what's going on. And it's problematic. The Whig partisans come out. You're talking Sumter, you're talking Francis Marion, and you're talking Pickens. They come out, and what they're going to do is, for the whole time this is occurring, they're going to harass Cornwallis's troops. More importantly, they're going to take violence. They're going to hit other things to make it rougher for him to do things. And in the back country, all this area where all this is supposed to be coming back into it, you have an internecine war. This is a war where it's groups against groups, and it's bloody as heck. It's a civil war. Guerrilla warfare, they have partisan attacks. People who are not part of the government, the whole political issue, know that if they can take Jim's house place over here, then they can have it for themselves. So there's everything from literally criminals acting like militia to militia, and it's an ongoing struggle and wave of violence with execution of prisoners, there's murders of civilians, destruction of homes, and the British are unable to even stop the Whigs. They can't even stop the loyalists from doing the same thing. So Cornwallis thinks part of the problem is these folks up here in Carolina are helping them out. So he wants to go bring them up here and try to stop this force coming, this whole issue down here by cutting off supplies. Now he's met by a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Greene, and when Morgan's defeated, and Greene is a different type of general. He's great, which is very different. But he understands the strategy necessary to beat the British in the South. And the problem here is that he knows that if you don't put in an effective government, if you don't have safety and security in these hamlets, then you have nothing, because nobody's going to trust you. So you have to be able to put it in. And so he does this asymmetrical warfare that I talked about, where they're hitting the supply lines and all. He uses Marion to harass the troops, to destroy their supplies and outposts, and maintain social order. In fact, one of the reasons he doesn't follow Cornwallis here is he's going back into South Carolina to fix that problem and try to bring it back into where it's a place where people can live. But he also follows what you would call a Fabian strategy. You never engage, if possible, in full battle, and you maintain your force. Washington did it up north, but it's a constant problem. What happens is, we have the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He finally stops and gives the British battle. Cornwallis won. Really did. He held the field. He had all of Greene's cannons. On top of the disease and casualties that had already been hit him. It's one of those Pyrrhic victories again, where all of a sudden he's standing there and he's won. He's cut off from a supply line chasing Greene. He's been harassed, everything else. So what do? Do you follow Greene if he goes up in the north into Virginia? Do you follow him if he goes down to South Carolina? Or do you go to Wilmington and resupply and figure out what you want to do, which is ultimately he'll go to New York. So in this case, he goes to Wilmington. Now what he's done is he prepared ahead of time in January of '81 by sending Major James Henry Grigg. He's the commander of the 82nd Regiment of Foot. We call him infantry today. And he arrived in January of 1781 with 300 troops, 4 artillery pieces, 3 warship shells, all the stuff that goes along with it. Orders are to seize Wilmington and establish a logistical support base that connects with Cross Creek via the river, so that when Cornwallis comes to work Cross Creek or needs supplies, he has a place where to get it. And also support loyalist militia in the area. When they landed in Wilmington, 9 miles south. 9 miles south of here, people know that they're there. Wilmington makes a decision. The leaders of Wilmington surrender. Okay. It's better than having the town reduced by those ships that can come up the river. And a lot of the Whigs, a significant number of the Whigs, the leaders fled town, including Cornelius Harnett and William Hooper, who happen to have lived a half a block down, where the deli is today. And 200 Whig militia marched south out of town, spiked the big guns, and they surrendered. And they're able to come into Wilmington. And I heard the part about the defeats the militia up at Heron's Bridge. They went north. The militia were coming down Heron's Bridge. Heron's Bridge up here, over the northeast portion of the Cape Fear, is one of 2 drawbridges actually operational in the 1700s. It's a fascinating piece. It's about where I-40 goes, I-140 goes across. Yes, difficulties with his mission. First of all, he can't find enough small boats to go up the river to Cross Creek. He also finds out that there are high bluffs along the river, and those pesky Whigs would get up on those bluffs and shoot. That's one of the reasons Mount Scary had its reputation, the Indians shot down. He had a reputation of cruelty, not well documented. It is a reputation, but there were 2 conclusions that came from it. If you were a loyalist, you got treated pretty well, and if you were a Whig, not so much. You go someplace where the Whigs are in charge, it reverses, and it's basically the thing. And it required people to take an oath to be committed to a dependence upon Great Britain. You didn't get a choice, you had to take it. His strategy includes capture of prominent rebels. Cornelius Harnett, John Ash were captured across the street behind the bank. That's where they were kept. They died of exposure, ultimately. And Harnett had other medical conditions. And out in the Ogden area, there were Whigs, a militia at the 8 Mile House. It's an ordinary, it was a tavern. They had been eating and drinking one evening, and the British caught them there, and they assaulted them with bayonet and all. It was a tough time. And but Craig thought that severity toward the rebels, coupled with aid to the loyalists, was the key for restoring British authority in southeastern North Carolina. That is actually the key to what they were supposed to be doing in South Carolina. That was what they were supposed to be doing in other areas, but they never quite got it done because of the aggressiveness of the troops. 9 April 1781, Cornwallis shows up here for two weeks to figure out what he wants to do. He blames loyalists for the failure, decides against staying here. The following rain already said that, and then he resolves to go back to Virginia to meet up with Major General Phillips, Chesapeake area, and he marches out of town with 1,400 troops. It is ordered to Charleston, and we are right there today. And we believe that his headquarters, which was here, and here we are, was about where he kept his command. It was probably where he stayed. Rick gets permission to stay. He's going to keep Cornwallis sick and wounded here. He's going to march with 300 regulars into the backcountry, collect loyalists from the different towns and all, and then use the loyalists to maintain a state of disorder in some ways rather than order, which Green was trying to do, to demonstrate that the rebels were able to actually do what they were trying to do, which was have a government. There was no middle ground, and either did an oath of allegiance or you got put away or maybe damaged. It was working in Blaine County with Colonel Thomas Morrison reported that the rebels were in a constant danger of their lives by a set of Tories and robbers that is protected by the British. They also in the north, David Fanny, who was an experienced guerrilla fighter as a colonel, and he did some lightning raids up in Chatham County and all. He did capture Whigs, and more importantly, he did capture Governor Burke up in Hillsborough. He also knew that he had support, supplies, and other things to go along with that. He also marched out on loyalist raids to Duplin County and New Bern. Greg did. Loyalist numbers were continue to grow. 3 companies actually joined up in Dobbs County. But one of the problems that they find is that when Craig leaves, they're not as effective. His final downfall was when Whig General Griffith Rutherford from the Salisbury District Militia sent 1,100 troops, and they were marching down here to deal with Major Craig. And he invests Wilmington. Craig is outnumbered 3-1. He prepares for a siege, and one of the things he did is he takes all the women. Single, and he has them leave the city with their children with clothes on their back. And people love him. Mid-November, news of the surrender of Cornwallis up in Wilmington comes, and Craig gets wise, and he goes ahead and decamps from the city on November 14th on the way back to Charleston and ultimately up north. What's interesting here, when we talk about that portion, it was an orderly, chaotic experience when they were trying to get on the ships. At one point, some Whig militia cavalry came down the street. It said that one of the cavalrymen used a sword and actually cut a man's head off. And he ran from one of the ships up the street, ran them out, and they were able to get the rest of the people on board. But the loyalists that could go and did go had to leave their stuff on the dock. So they were going out empty handed. Hey, I got to the end, sorry. I know I went over 16 minutes long. Good for me. Do you have any questions for me? I know I hit a lot of stuff here.
Is that split between loyalists and Whig? You were saying 20%. Is that typical in most states, in most colonies, or is that just because of
That's more of one of these.
Yeah.
It's a general guesstimate. John and I have talked about it quite a bit. That's as close as they can get. It's the middle group that expands and contracts. It depends on who's in charge. It comes out of the woodwork. But if you talk North Carolina, especially, you get in the backcountry, they just want to be left alone. They want to be able to get their crop in. You've got pig farmers in the north ends of Hanover County and coastlands, those high boggy areas, that run pigs during the summer, and then in the fall they run them up to Virginia and sell them. They don't have time to get in the militia and go someplace. They also get upset because the militia and the Continentals and the Redcoats come through there, and what do? They need pork. So they take pork and they give him scripts, and if you're getting Continental currency, good luck with that. It's this whole thing of they're being preyed on by both of the antagonists. And then there's this whole group in the middle who are using that as an excuse to take stuff as well. It's a chaotic scene. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I was wondering like in New York and in New Jersey.
It's a general, and again, it depends on location. But if you think of it in terms of 20, 60, you get a general idea of what you have. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. My question is, we've heard that up on the cliff overlooking the Cape Fear River, was a Revolutionary War encampment.
The encampment,
Do you know that, or can you,
there's two sets of encampments here. You have these lines here that were block and a half over there. Were actually set up by the Whigs that were in the area when they were in charge. And then the British took them over because they were already good placements. They had places you could stand behind, revetments and all. And then they could put their headquarters and all in here. So yes, they were right over here. It's all town now. But if you think of this area, it's a bluff going steeply down to the river. And with time, they built it up. It was steeper back then. So
that's where they would have all been tents when you say.
yes, the Redcoats district.
I have a few questions from online. The first one is they would like to know where the best source of information about the British garrison in Wilmington at the time Cornwallis retreated there before he advanced to Virginia.
I would suggest that as far as a book would be Redcoats on the River by Dunleavy. There's also a book called Southern Gambit that is good about the whole Southern campaign, but it just treats this area as part of it. It's not a big thing. But I would really recommend the Redcoats on the Cape Fear. There are also, if you have access to any type of internet where you can look at archive records and all, there's one called the British Expedition to Wilmington by a gentleman by the name of Gregory Van de Massey, M-A-S-S-E-Y. And much of the work by a gentleman by the name of, I'm making sure I get it all right, Ira D. Gruber is also very good. He wrote a couple of books and also about the Southern campaign. So, but I would really go with the Dunleavy book to start with, basically.
And then a second one is, after 3 terrible losses, Kings Mountain, Cowspen, and Guilford Courthouse in a short period of time, why would Cornwallis stay only 17 days in Wilmington before marching north to Virginia? I think it's remarkable that he took his greatly reduced force back on the campaign trail after such a brief rest in Wilmington.
Yes. It's hard to tell. One thing I think it bears witness to Cornwallis a little bit is that Cornwallis was not unwilling to take risks. Cornwallis was not unwilling to go to Virginia with 1,400 troops because he was going there with 1,400 regulars. Not only were there regulars, they were combat hardened regulars. And he felt fairly confident they could at least get up and join up with the army, the British Army up there. Secondly, he had intel that Greene was going down into the Carolinas. And looking at you to make sure you got head in that. John and I worked together at Fort Fisher. We're both colonials, so hard. That there was less, the forces that were going to be actually opposing him then would have been militia forces. And in some ways were a hodgepodge. They weren't a large group.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
How were the loyalists treated after war, especially the Wilmington area? Most of them stick around?
Well, there's I think the one that they were, many of them got to leave. They got to go to Canada and they got to do other things. I think one of the most telling ones is here in the town. Directly behind us is one of the other colonial homes, the Burgwin-Wright House. And Mrs. Boatwright and her younger son were there, and the older, and they were loyalists, and the older son, who was a Whig, ran him out of town, basically, and got him out of the house and ran him out of town. You have John Burgwin, who goes to England. He's wise, because he knew that he was a loyalist and he was going to have problems. He comes back after the war, and under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, he petitions for his lands back, his properties back. And he actually gets it. The general consensus is maybe 1% or 2% of people got anything. If they were lucky, they got to go out of town without getting hurt. A lot of animosity with him. And a lot of hatreds that build up in these cycles of who is in charge. You disagree? John? Okay, great. Anything else? Listen,
I assume that many enslaved people had left along with the loyalists.
you know, one of the things that the big worry was that to start with, you know, they were worried in the South that the British were going to offer the opportunity for the enslaved African Americans to join them. And in fact, Mark talks about how it has the loyalists and the enslaved African Americans in this whole thing of trying to get the ammunition and the arms and all, that he could carry it. There were a significant number that got on ships when Craig left because they had the opportunity. And as I understand, the majority made it up to New York and into Canada. And that's what I understand right now. That's what I understand, which means I'm still going to be looking at that some more because I'm not comfortable completely with that. Anything else? Okay, there's a dead. Question. Okay, what did King George III think about the Americans? He thought they were revolting. I told you it's a dad joke. I have a daughter here.
So to my online audience, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have missed anything or would like to go back and review the tape, we have this recorded. It will be uploaded to our website at www.Burgwin-Wright House.com under the Events and Recorded Programs 2021 tab in the next day or two. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's give Rick one more hand.
Thank you.